Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Braidwood from LearnAnatomy by Drawing.com, and I want to present in this video a framework for learning to draw. My students who are learning anatomy through me don't necessarily need to follow this, but if they happen to get interested and wanted to continue to learn to draw, this would be a good place to start. And for anyone else learning to draw, I hope this is useful for you. And that's because there's actually never been a better time to learn how to draw. There are thousands of hours of tutorials available on the internet, much of it free, and not to mention the traditional classrooms that are still available. So finding lessons is not the problem. What I hope to do is outline a framework to conceptualize how to learn to draw and how to navigate all of that material that is available to you in a sensible way. So firstly, I break drawing down into two core skills. And obviously there's a lot to these, but just at a high level. The first is, can you draw the lines that you see? Now this is really a hand-eye coordination issue. You've got a reference and there's a straight line in the reference. Can you actually draw a straight line where it needs to be? Or a circle, can you draw a circle when you're trying to draw a car tire, for example? Now I have a video on drawing better lines for beginners, which goes through some ways you can improve your hand-eye coordination, so be sure to check that out. The second skill is, can you see the lines that you need? And this really speaks to the so-called artist's eye, the ability to take a complex subject and reproduce it accurately enough to look like the subject with some, with or without some artistic interpretation. Now this is where you'll spend much of your time when learning how to draw, training your brain and hand to work together through your eye. Now it's actually quite a fascinating process to go through when you can see how much your brain gets things wrong. It reminds me of a great quote by the philosopher Anais Nin, who said, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are." And it speaks to how much interpretation is going on. We don't just objectively perceive something through our vision. The brain is constantly interpreting it and presenting us with its version of what you are seeing. So a lot of learning to draw is overcoming that and being able to see things accurately. Okay, taking all those into account and putting those into some perspective, I want to talk about the hierarchy of difficulty, which is something I really wish I knew about when I was starting out. And we're going to draw this on a graph. Okay, so let's start that now. We've got our graph here like this, and this really is difficulty. Okay, this is the difficulty that I'm talking about. And here we have the subject, which is the thing that you are, sorry, not the subject, the reference, which is what you are using to draw from. And here we have the subject, which is what you are actually drawing. Okay, so the most simple reference, most simple thing to draw from is another drawing. Okay, so this is a cartoon or somebody else's illustration of something. Now the reason that's the easiest is because the other artist has done much of the hard work for you. They've chosen the lines that you need, they've simplified a subject down to the core lines that create an accurate representation of that subject. So if you draw from that, you are drawing their lines, but you are practicing drawing those lines and those shapes together. And it's a worthwhile exercise to go back and draw from artists that you like or the masters, because you start to get a feel of how they chose their lines and how they drew their lines. But that's the simplest, okay? So the next most difficult is from a photograph. Now the reason a photograph is more difficult than a drawing is because that simplification hasn't happened. The photo is full of details. Unless you are trying to do photorealism, much of the details you're going to want to leave alone. You don't actually want to capture them. So your eye and your brain has to make sense of all this excess detail and distill them down into something artistic. And that can be overwhelming and very confusing and takes practice, and therefore is harder than drawing, using a drawing as a reference. Next most difficult is from life. Okay. Now, not only have you got all this detail in life that you have in photograph, life is in 3D, whereas a photograph is in 2D. So the photograph has translated a three-dimensional subject into two dimensions, because on a page we don't have the third dimension, we don't have depth, we only have the illusion of depth that we're trying to create. Whereas in life, you're looking at a subject that has the 3 dimensions, and you need to do that translation. So that is why drawing from life is harder than drawing from a photo. And the last one, people might disagree with me here, but I think I can make a good case, is that drawing from imagination. And the reason is that you are now the reference. You have to have the reference in your brain, you have to be able to visualize it and then use that. Now, I'm not talking about here about just drawing some crazy random spaceship that, you know, no one would recognize. Okay, everyone can do that. What I'm talking about is drawing realistic objects that work in 3-dimensional space and look like the things that you're trying to make it look like. You know, a spaceship looks like a spaceship, it looks like it could fly, and all the perspective is correct, etc., etc. Or drawing a person from your imagination and having the limbs the right length and the right dimension and the gesture and so forth. Okay, so that's your reference. Now we're talking about subject. What we're talking about here is, well, okay, so the simplest thing is simple shapes. And here I'm talking about things like a sphere or maybe a pyramid, that kind of idea. Okay. Next, complex shapes. Now there's some exceptions which we're going to come to, but I'm talking here about things like buildings, cars, toasters, that sort of thing. All right, next I would put landscapes, plants, etc. Now you may find these aren't in quite the right order for you, that's fine. This is going to be somewhat subjective, but you're kind of getting the idea of what I'm talking about here. Insects are lovely to draw, they're segmented, and often those segments are quite simple, good fun. Now I want to put here an exception, I guess, to complex shapes, which are even harder. Certainly I consider them, and that is things like planes and boats. They have really long, subtle curves, which makes them quite challenging to get right. Next is animals. Now, again, organic shapes with subtle curves, difficult. People, for the same reason that animals are difficult, but viewers of your drawing are very good at recognizing a shape of a person, will very quickly pick up errors. And lastly, I would put faces, and a special case of faces is likeness. Now, why faces? Because the human brain is so adept at picking up subtleties in faces. We even over-detect and see faces in clouds, and so viewers will very quickly pick up an error. It reminds me of this John Singer Sargent, I think he's American painter John Singer Sargent, who said that a portrait is a likeness in which there is something wrong with the mouth, and I love it because he's really getting at the fact that the mouth is capable of such subtle expression that trying to capture that is very difficult. Okay, so how do we use this? Well, so 2 ways. One is to map out your journey and how you're going to do it. So, for example, I recommend you start here, drawing simple shapes and work upwards. Okay, my art teacher initially he would stack cubes on the table and say, "Away you go, draw the cubes." And really, really useful exercise, and sounds much easier than it is. And I do recommend you get to here, because being able to draw simple shapes from your imagination will help you with the rest of this. Okay, and then you work your way along and up. Okay, if you're going to start doing a car, I would say start a car with someone else's drawing, because cars are actually deceptively difficult, and that would be a good place to start. And again, work your way up. I see some people jump in learning to draw at life drawing, and it's so difficult to do well. And if you start here, or if you haven't gone through a lot of this, you're going to get frustrated and possibly want to quit, because it is in terms of the hierarchy of difficulty, right up there. Now, the other way to learn it is to sort of plan out what will make you think, or help you think about what you want to do. You may decide, well, I'm just going to do travel sketchbooks without many people in it, just the places that I'm going. So you're really aiming to get here. So you might spend most of your time there. Now, if you've been to classical, or you're planning on going to classical training, they will take you up to here, and you'll be able to do this without any problem if you can do this. But you may focus here and say, well, I'm not going to put so much energy in learning to paint or learning to draw people. The The artists who live up in this space, in imagination and people, okay, they're movie animators and graphic novelists, graphic novel artists. And I should clarify that I'm not trying to say that drawing or painting from imagination is somehow superior. Monet painted mostly landscapes and buildings, but created extraordinary artworks. Likewise, a portrait artist would never draw or paint from their imagination because the result would almost always be inferior to using a live reference or a photograph. So this is not a hierarchy of worth or quality, but a roadmap to help you understand where you are, where you're going, and how to get there. So a good example of this is, say that perhaps one day you produce something you were proud of and you think you're finally getting the hang of this drawing, and then the next day you draw something that you hate and it feels like you've gone backwards. This can happen because you've moved along this hierarchy of difficulty without realizing it. Remember that this is all based upon my experiences learning to draw as an adult, and you may have a different experience, which is fine. Now, back to artists drawing from their imagination. So they need to be able to draw, the same character, so get the character's likeness right from their imagination in certain poses. So, for example, that character might be jumping through the air, doing a half somersault, firing off a bow and arrow. And you're not going to have a reference for that. Yes, you might use some photographs to help out, but that needs to come from your imagination. So really highly skilled. And so if you're aiming to do that, then that shows you what how you need to be able to get there. In order to be able to do that from your imagination, you need to have what we call a visual library, which is you need to have drawn these things many, many times before and be able to draw them from your head because they're so familiar to you. Okay, so that's what you need to do to get to that. What I've done on learnanatomy.drawing.com is I've collated a bunch of resources that help you at each of these stages. And so wherever you are in this journey, you can go down and find out, some useful resources to say, learn how to draw animals from your imagination, or that sort of thing. So check that out. There you go. Hope that's helpful, and happy drawing.